This photo was taken on June 19, 1944, at Camp Hearn, Texas, by military photographer Robert "Red" Halston, a man assigned to document routine camp operations during the war, but what he captured that morning was anything but routine. In the image, a thin German prisoner of war stands beside an American sergeant. Their hands grip the same rope. Together, they are raising the American flag. Not fighting, not resisting, not acting like enemies at all. A POW in denim, a U.S. Army sergeant in full uniform, side by side, under the same flag. Why was a German prisoner allowed to touch the stars and stripes? Why did an American sergeant let him help raise it? And even more shocking, why do both men look as though in that moment they forgot they were supposed to be on opposite sides of a world war? What happened before this picture was taken, and what happened after? That changed every man who witnessed it. June 18, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. Dawn had barely begun to lift its pale gray curtain across the horizon when the wind finally died. Hours earlier, a night storm had rolled through the plains, hard, sudden, the kind of Texas thunder that rattled the barracks and shook dust from beams older than the camp itself. Now, in the stillness that followed, the last drops clung to the barbed wire like beads of glass. Johann Keller stepped out of Barracks 12 with the slow, stiff gait of someone who had forgotten how a quiet morning felt. At 22, he looked older, lean, hollow-cheeked, skin tanned by work details under the brutal sun. He tugged the collar of his denim work shirt as he walked, expecting nothing more than another day of labor, dust, and the strange, confusing normalcy of American captivity. Then he saw it. Half buried in the mud near the flagpole, its stars smeared with dirt and its stripes limp from the storm, lay an American flag. Johann stopped so sharply that the prisoner behind him nearly collided with him. The others followed his stare, and for a moment no one breathed. The wind gave a weak sigh, lifting one corner of the flag as if trying to call attention to the impossible sight. A German prisoner of war, standing alone in the center of an American camp, facing the fallen symbol of the country that held him captive. It was a picture no one had ever prepared for. Johann walked toward it before he fully realized what he was doing. Mud squelched under his boots. His heart hammered. When he crouched and reached out his hand, the entire yard seemed to tighten around him. He felt dozens of eyes boring into his back, the German prisoners frozen in place, the American guards on the towers pausing mid-stride, even the cooks walking toward the mess tent, stopping with coffee mugs halfway to their lips. No one moved. No one spoke. Johann's fingers brushed the wet fabric. A whisper rippled through the prisoners behind him. "He's touching it. Has he lost his mind? They'll shoot him for that." For a heartbeat, Johann believed they might be right. All his life he had been taught that Americans worshipped their flag the way Germans worshipped discipline, absolutely, unquestioningly. His commanding officers had warned them that desecrating American symbols was an offense punishable by immediate death. But the flag was lying in the mud, and something in him, something he could not name, wouldn't let him walk past it. He lifted it carefully, mud dripping from the stars. Silence spread like a sheet of ice. From the nearest guard tower, Private Leonard Hayes watched through narrowed eyes, unsure whether he was witnessing an act of defiance or something else entirely. His hand hovered near the strap of his rifle. Below him, Sergeant Willard Grayson leaned forward, squinting. "What the hell is he doing?" Grayson muttered. But Johann didn't hear them. He was staring at the fabric now resting in his hands, heavy with water and grit. His throat tightened. It felt wrong to hold it, wrong to be the one touching it, and yet Wrong to leave it in the mud as well. He hesitated. Behind him, German prisoners whispered nervously. No one dared step closer. For Johann, the moment stretched into something unreal. He thought of the propaganda films he had been shown as a teenager, grotesque caricatures of Americans, sloppy and violent, a nation of mongrels without honor. Yet in the weeks he had been here in Texas, he had seen no brutality, no starvation, no humiliation. He had seen order, clean barracks, food given on time, work that, while hard, was not cruel. He had also seen Americans raise this very flag every morning at sunrise. Guards would stand still, hats removed, hands over hearts. Even the prisoners had learned not to speak during the ceremony. The gesture was unfamiliar, but the seriousness unmistakable. And now the same flag lay in his hands. Johann pressed his lips together, took a slow breath, and did the only thing that felt decent. He wiped the mud from its stars with his sleeve. A collective gasp rippled across the yard. Up in the tower, Hayes exhaled sharply. "Sarge, you see that? He's cleaning it." Grayson didn't answer. He simply watched. Johann rose to his feet, the flag draped across his forearms like a wounded thing. His chest tightened with a strange, uncertain anxiety. He wasn't trying to provoke anyone. He wasn't trying to earn favor. He simply couldn't bear to see a symbol treated with less respect than the people who saluted it each morning. He took a step toward the nearest guard. The other prisoners stiffened. Several looked ready to bolt, even though there was nowhere to run. The guards on the tower leaned forward, fingers tense, undecided between raising their rifles or simply waiting to see what the young German was about to do. Johann paused halfway, then continued. Every step seemed louder than the previous one. He reached the base of the flagpole, looked up at the empty rope flapping gently against the metal, then turned toward the American officer approaching across the yard. Captain Miller, a man in his 40s with steady eyes and a sun-creased face carved from the Texas plains. He had seen combat in North Africa, watched friends die, and commanded men through battles that felt like the world collapsing. Yet nothing in his war-hardened years prepared him for this sight. A German POW holding the American flag as if carrying a sacred relic. Miller slowed his stride. The dust beneath his boots drifted around him. Johann swallowed hard. His voice, when it came, was thin but steady. "Sir, this fell." He extended the flag. Miller stopped in front of him, his eyes settling on the smeared stripes, the specks of mud still clinging to the stars. The officer's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing. Behind them, the camp held its breath. Johann stood frozen, waiting, for whatever came next, and in that suspended instant, an image burned itself into the memory of every man watching. A German prisoner offering back the heart of America, not tearing it, not mocking it, not trampling it, offering it back. In a country that, in 1944, stood at the height of its power, producing more planes, more ships, more tanks than any nation in history, this simple act struck deeper than any weapon. Because America's strength wasn't just its factories, it was its principles. And now, under a pale Texas sunrise, even a German POW seemed to understand that. Johann didn't dare breathe. His hands, still damp from gripping the wet fabric, trembled at his sides. Even the faint rustle of the flag against his sleeve felt deafening in the frozen silence. A warning from childhood rang in his skull with the clarity of a bell. His instructors had repeated it like scripture. His sergeant in France had sworn it was the first rule of American fanaticism. And every whispered rumor among captured soldiers only fed the terror. The Americans don't tolerate disrespect, especially toward their flag. Now, here he was, the German boy who should have known better, standing exposed with the very symbol of the enemy in his hands. He forced himself to look up. 2 American guards were already moving toward him. Their boots hit the gravel in sharp, measured steps, and each step punched another spike of fear into Johann's chest. One guard's hand hovered near his rifle strap. The other squinted as if trying to decide whether Johann was cleaning the flag or preparing to desecrate it. The space between them shrank too quickly. Behind Johann, the German prisoners watched as though staring at a live execution. No one dared call out to him. No one dared intervene. Several took a step back, as if distance alone might spare them from whatever was about to happen. Johann could feel their dread radiating behind him. It made his own fear worse. He swallowed hard. A bead of sweat slid down his spine. If he moved too suddenly, they might think he was attacking. If he froze, they might think he was hiding something. If he dropped the flag, they might think he was defiling it. Everything, every muscle, every instinct told him one thing. This is it. This is how a man dies in Texas. The whispers from the German line grew louder, frayed with panic. He's finished. He's doomed us. Why would he pick it up? Idiot. They'll think he's mocking them. These men were not cowards. They had marched through fire in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. Many had watched friends die. They had survived Allied bombing, starvation, and retreat. But America was different. America was the great unknown. Most of these prisoners had lived their entire lives under Nazi propaganda. They were told Americans were violent, dishonorable, a mongrel nation built on greed and savagery. They were told American soldiers shot prisoners on the spot for insults, real or imagined. They were told American patriotism bordered on holy obsession, that the flag was worshipped, not saluted. And now Johann, foolish, impulsive, well-meaning Johann, stood at the center of the yard holding that very flag like a man cradling a grenade. One of the older prisoners, Becker, wrung his hand so tightly his knuckles whitened. He'd once fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred west, and he had seen brutality on a scale that burned into the soul. "Americans are not Soviets," another prisoner muttered. "Maybe they'll listen." "You think that matters now?" Becker snapped. "He touched their flag." Someone else whispered, "Better pray the officer is in a good mood today." But none of them believed that. They had heard too many stories of officers taking insult as personal offense. And with the Normandy invasion only days old, tensions crackled through the camp like electricity in a storm. Many American soldiers had brothers or cousins fighting in France at this very moment. They listened to the news reports every evening. They knew the casualties were rising. They were angry, on edge, grieving in silence. This was the worst possible moment for a German prisoner to be seen meddling with the American flag. Johann felt their fear like a weight pressing against his back. It pushed him forward, toward the approaching guards, because turning around would look like retreat. Running would look like guilt. So he walked, one step, another, each one soft, controlled, careful, like a man walking through a minefield. Up in the nearest tower, Private Hayes wiped his palms on his uniform, unsure whether to intervene or to stay still. "Does he think he's doing us a favor?" he muttered. Sergeant Grayson beside him frowned deeply. "I don't know what he thinks he's doing. But if he drops that flag—" Hayes shifted uneasily. "Sarge, we're supposed to stop any disrespect." "Yeah," Grayson muttered. "But we're also supposed to shoot only when we damn well know what we're looking at." That was the problem. No one knew what they were looking at. On the ground, the two guards, Private Russell and Corporal Henry Dunn, reached Johann first. Russell's hand was still on his rifle strap, not raised but not relaxed either. Dunn's eyes darted from Johann's face to the flag, then to the officer who was now striding toward them across the yard. "Stop right there," Dunn said sharply. Johann froze mid-step, flag still held in both hands like an offering. Russell's voice was tight. "What are you doing with that?" The prisoners behind Johann seemed to stop breathing entirely. Johann felt his mouth go dry. His tongue felt too big, his throat too tight. His English was poor, his voice tiny when he finally forced the words out. It was in the mud. Both guards stiffened at the phrase. Russell took a small step back, not out of fear, but out of pure surprise. A POW picking up a fallen American flag, that wasn't in any manual. That wasn't something they were trained for. Dunn studied Johann's face, searching for mockery. He found none. No smile, no smirk, just fear. And something else. Something he couldn't name yet. Still, the tension hung thick. Behind Johann, a prisoner finally cracked under the pressure and whispered louder than he intended. "They'll shoot him. Watch." A few Americans heard it. Russell exhaled slowly. He didn't lift his rifle, but he didn't relax either. This was the most dangerous kind of moment, a moment full of misunderstanding, fear, pride, and symbols heavier than bullets. And then Captain Miller arrived. The guards straightened at once. Johann stiffened. The prisoners shrank back. The captain's jaw was set, his stride controlled but urgent. He had heard enough to know something was wrong. His men wouldn't crowd a POW unless they believed a line had been crossed. Miller looked at Johann, then at the flag, then at the mud still dripping from its edge. For a moment, he said nothing. Johann felt his knees weaken. This was it, the verdict, the judgment. The fear that had been coiled inside him since childhood reached its breaking point. He braced himself for the shout, for the order, for the gunshot he had been taught to expect. The entire camp held its breath, and in that suspended second, fear reached its peak. The rubber band stretched to its limit, ready to snap. What came next would not be rage, nor punishment, nor retribution. But Johann didn't know that yet. All he knew was fear. Raw, crushing, blinding fear. Fear that made even the Texas sun feel cold. For a moment, Johann stood completely still, the flag clutched in his hands, the air around him tight enough to crack. He could have dropped it. That would have been the simplest thing. Let the mud reclaim it, let the Americans pick it up themselves, let the moment slip away before it swallowed him whole. He could have stepped on it unintentionally or otherwise. He could have backed away with his hands raised. He could have run. But Johann did none of those things. Instead, slowly, almost reverently, he lifted a corner of the flag and began wiping the mud from its stars with the sleeve of his prison shirt. Time seemed to fracture around him. Every breath in the yard caught mid-chest. Every insect hum, every rustle of wind, every footstep froze in place. The prisoners behind him stared as though watching a man walk into a fire. Even the guards momentarily forgot the rifles slung at their sides. Up in the tower, Private Hayes leaned forward, eyes wide. "Hold on," he whispered. "Sarge, he's cleaning it." Sergeant Grayson didn't answer at first. His jaw hung slightly open, the lines around his eyes hardening in disbelief. Below them, Corporal Dunn actually lowered his hand from his rifle. Strap. His brows knitting into an expression he hadn't worn since he was a boy at Sunday school. Awe. Johann kept wiping. Not frantically, not nervously. A slow, careful motion. His face was pale, but there was something steady in the way he held the flag, as if he understood more than he could explain. Dust and moisture lifted under his sleeve. The red stripes reappeared, smudged but bright. The blue canton regained its shape, no longer caked with earth. A single star caught the morning sun and flickered, and across the yard something shifted, first quietly, then unmistakably. The fear did not disappear, but it changed flavor. It became confusion, then wonder, then something else entirely. The Americans had never seen anything like it. Private Russell rubbed the back of his neck. "Is he making fun of us?" "No," Dunn murmured almost against his will. "He's being careful." Russell shook his head. "Careful? He's a German. Why would he—" Dunn didn't finish the sentence. Because the truth was unsettling. Because the gesture defied every expectation they held about the enemy. Because in that moment, Johann Keller did not look like a soldier of the Reich. He looked like a young man cleaning something sacred. For the guards, men raised on Depression-era hardship, taught to revere the flag as the one thing that never faltered, the sight struck with the force of a punch. Many had buried brothers who died wearing the very symbol now resting in a German prisoner's palms. Many had stood by as flag-draped coffins returned home from North Africa and Sicily. And only days earlier, word from Normandy had shaken the camp with fresh grief. The flag was not fabric to them, it was memory. It was sacrifice. It was home. And here was a German boy, thin, sunburned, barely more than a kid, wiping mud from its stars like a man tending to a wounded comrade. It made no sense, and yet it made absolute sense. Captain Miller reached them at last. He stopped a few paces away, breathing harder than he expected. He looked from the guards to Johann to the flag. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus, the way a preacher might study an unexpected scripture laid before him. Johann swallowed. The motion of his hands ceased. He held the flag in both palms and stepped forward one pace, then another. His boots sank into the soft ground, but his posture did not waver. When he was close enough, he extended the flag toward Miller with both hands. 2 hands open, 2 hands offering, not hiding, 2 hands returning something that did not belong to him. Captain Miller's throat tightened. In all his years of service, in battles across Tunisia, in the dust of Kasserine Pass, in the chaos of the Sicilian landing, he had learned to expect many things from the enemy. Treachery, desperation, brutality, courage, even fear. He had not learned to expect respect. Certainly not this kind. For a moment he said nothing. Somewhere behind him, a guard cleared his throat, unsure whether he should interpret the silence as approval or restraint. But Miller continued staring at Johann with an expression no one could decipher. Finally, he spoke. "What made you pick it up?" His voice was even, but the question carried weight. Johann shifted his stance, unable to look away from the officer's eyes. "It was in the mud," he said softly. "And I thought it should not be." Miller blinked. The guards exchanged looks. Even the prisoners behind Johann seemed startled. The line between enemy and ally blurred slightly, like a pencil stroke smudged by a thumb. The captain's voice, when it came again, sounded different. Lower, almost contemplative. "You didn't have to clean it." Johann nodded once, the movement slow and uncertain. "I know." "And yet you did." Another nod, this one even smaller. The captain looked down at the flag, then back at Johann. Memories flickered through his mind. Boys he had trained with in Georgia, men he had buried in Tunisia, telegrams he had written to families explaining why their sons would never return. He had watched friends die under this symbol. He had seen it raised after victories, lowered after losses, folded over bodies he carried with his own hands. The idea that a German prisoner, someone raised under a banner that devoured Europe, would treat the American flag with reverence. It went against every expectation, and yet it felt right. Slowly, Miller extended his hands and accepted the flag. Not snatched, not yanked, accepted. The transfer was deliberate, ceremonial, quiet, the kind of quiet that reshapes a moment into something unforgettable. The guards stood straighter. The prisoners watched with wide, uncertain eyes. Johann held his breath as the flag left his grip. Miller ran a thumb along one star, brushing away the last smear of mud. His jaw clenched as if wrestling with a feeling he had not expected to experience toward a German prisoner. It was not gratitude exactly, not trust, not forgiveness. It was respect, not given freely, but earned irrevocably in a single gesture. Behind them, the Texas morning grew brighter, pushing away the remnants of the storm. The sky opened into a clear expanse of blue, flag blue, stretching endlessly above the camp. Miller took a step back and studied Johann with new eyes. "You returned it," he said quietly, like returning something sacred. Johann lowered his gaze, unsure how to respond. He had not intended to be symbolic. He had simply acted on instinct, an instinct that told him a fallen symbol deserved to be lifted. But the Americans did not see instinct. They saw reverence. They saw honor. They saw something they never expected from a German POW. And in that moment, the camp softened, not fully, not visibly, but undeniably. Because kindness had entered a place built for war. Unexpected, unscripted, undeniable. And it came from the enemy. Captain Miller didn't move at first. The flag rested in his hands, its fabric still damp, its weight somehow heavier than before. A muscle in his jaw twitched. His lips parted slightly as if he wanted to speak but could not yet find the strength. Johann watched him, the fear in his chest slowly giving way to something stranger, a trembling uncertainty that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. His heart pounded so hard he thought the guards might hear it. Miller finally exhaled, a sound caught between a breath and a sigh. "You returned it." He paused, swallowed once, and his voice dropped to a rough whisper. "Like returning our honor." The words struck the yard with the force of a shockwave. A murmur rippled through the American guards, quiet, stunned, reverent. None had expected their captain to say something so raw, so personal, especially to a prisoner. But Miller said it like a confession, something torn from deep inside him. Johann stood frozen. He didn't understand all the words, but he understood enough. Honor. He had heard that word 1,000 times in Germany. But never like this. This one sounded wounded and grateful at the same time. Behind Johann, a German prisoner, Fischer, a wiry 40-year-old from Stuttgart, covered his mouth with both hands. His eyes filled so suddenly it startled even him. A tear slid down his cheek, and in the silence that followed Miller's words, the sound of his quiet sob broke the tension like glass cracking. It wasn't weakness. It was release. Fischer had survived bombings, firestorms, a collapsing front, the death of 2 brothers. He had seen cities burned until nothing remained but stone skeletons and smoke. He had seen German civilians claw through rubble looking for breadcrumbs. He had heard officers shouting that Americans would torture them, starve them, break them. And now he stood in the middle of Texas watching a U.S. Army captain speak of honor, not to an American, not to a friend, but to one of them, the enemy. His shoulders shook, a choked sob escaped him. Another prisoner turned away, wiping his face with his sleeve. A third lowered his head, unable to look at the flag or at Johann without feeling something ripping inside his chest. It wasn't just the gesture. It was everything it contradicted. Years of propaganda, years of fear, years of believing that Americans were monsters made of greed and rage. And yet here they were, treating an act of respect from a POW with a gravity so deep it resembled grief. On the American side, silence filled the yard with a different weight. Private Hayes swallowed hard. His own brother had died on Utah Beach just 2 weeks earlier, and he'd only learned of it 3 days before. He hadn't cried. Not yet. He'd held the grief in his chest like a stone, waiting for it to crush him. Now, watching Johann stand there trembling, hands empty after offering back the flag, Hayes felt the stone shift. He glanced at Sergeant Grayson. The older man stood completely still, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on Johann with an expression Hayes had never seen on him before, something between shock and reluctant admiration. Dunn, the corporal beside them, lowered his head slightly. Not in shame. In respect. Few Americans had ever witnessed a German soldier treat the stars and stripes with anything but indifference or hostility. And to see a prisoner, hungry, ragged, exhausted, lift it out of the mud and offer it back with both hands? It was almost biblical. Captain Miller's fingers tightened around the flag. He blinked, and for the briefest instant his expression cracked wide open. He remembered the letters he had written. He remembered holding the hands of dying men. He remembered a 20-year-old private from Ohio, shot through the lung in Tunisia, whispering, "Tell my mother I love her. Tell her I didn't fall backwards." He remembered carrying that boy's flag-draped body to a temporary cemetery beneath alien stars. And now, here stood a German boy offering back the same symbol with a respect deeper than many Americans showed it. Miller's voice wavered. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "But you did." Johann felt something fracture inside him. All his life he had been told Americans were brutes. All his training warned him they were ruthless, uncultured, incapable of respect. All his friends had sworn that American compassion was a lie. But here, under the morning sun, compassion wasn't a rumor. It was a face, a voice, a man holding his nation's flag with tears trapped behind his eyes. Johann's breath hitched. His hands began to tremble violently. He didn't know whether to bow, salute, or simply collapse. Around them, the German prisoners felt their own foundations shake. Becker, the veteran of the Eastern Front, whispered hoarsely, "Everything we were told, everything, was wrong." A younger prisoner beside him muttered, "If this is how they treat their flag, how will they treat us?" Not with cruelty, not with vengeance, with humanity. That realization, more than anything, broke them. A few prisoners lowered their heads, overwhelmed. Another crossed himself unconsciously. A third whispered, barely audible, "If our own officers had half this dignity, Germany would look different today." Propaganda didn't shatter in one dramatic moment. It eroded, quietly, devastatingly, like ice melting under sunlight, the sunlight of American kindness. Captain Miller turned to the nearest guard. "Get a clean rope," he said softly. "We're raising her back up." His voice was steady now, but gentler than his men had ever heard it. Hayes nodded and jogged off, returning moments later with a fresh length of rope. The captain threaded it through the pulley atop the flagpole with slow, deliberate care. The entire yard watched him work. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the wind held still. Miller looked at Johann. "Help me." The German boy froze. "Help? You?" Miller nodded once. "You caught it. You cleaned it. You should help raise it." A gasp rippled through the prisoners. A few of the Americans widened their eyes. This was unheard of. A German touching the flag was one thing. A German helping to raise it was another entirely. Johann stepped forward, hesitation trembling through every motion. His hands reached the rope just below Miller's. The two men, enemies by uniform, strangers by fate, gripped the same line together. Miller nodded. They pulled. The flag rose slowly, water droplets flinging off as it ascended, catching the morning light like sparks. It reached the midpoint of the pole, then higher still. When it reached the top, the wind finally returned as if waiting for its cue. The fabric snapped open, unfurling into full color. Red, white, blue. The sound echoed through the camp, and every man, German and American, felt something tighten in his chest. Captain Miller let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. So did Johann. The captain turned to him. For a long moment, the two simply looked at each other, one searching for meaning, the other trying to explain what he himself didn't understand. Then Miller spoke one final time, barely above a whisper. "You returned it like returning our honor." Johann's knees nearly buckled. Behind him, Fischer cried openly now. Becker wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Even the younger Germans stared with an ache they couldn't name, as if watching the world tilt on its axis. The American guards stood silent, not triumphant, not suspicious, but humbled, moved. Because in that moment, the enemy honored their flag with a purity that cut straight to the bone. It reminded them of who they were, of what they fought for, of what their fathers and brothers had died believing America stood for, and that, more than anything, broke them open, not with rage, not with fear, with pride, with grief, with gratitude. This was the America they wanted to remember. This was the America they wanted to be. This was the America their fathers had built. Under the rising flag, shimmering in the Texas sun, the war felt far away for a moment, and humanity felt close. That night, long after the evening bell echoed across Camp Hearn and the barracks settled into the soft murmur of men shifting in their bunks, Johann Keller sat alone at the small wooden table near the window. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting a pale circle of light onto the diary he had carried since Tunisia. The pages were worn, corners bent, stained with dust, sweat, and months of uncertainty. His hand hovered above the paper, unsure where to begin. He finally dipped the pencil. June 18, 1944. Tonight something happened. I cannot explain. He paused, staring at the ink forming as if it were written by someone else. They told us Americans had no honor. They told us their flag was a lie, their people soft, their soldiers lazy and crude. But today they treated their flag, and me, with dignity. He pressed harder, the pencil tip almost tearing the page. I do not know what to believe anymore. The words sat there, stark and undeniable. He stared at them for a long time, feeling a pressure in his chest he had no name for. Shame? Gratitude? Confusion? A strange, trembling mixture of all three. He wrote more. If the Americans were as cruel as we were taught, they would have shot me without hesitation. If they were the barbarians our officers described, why would a captain thank me? Why would he look at me the way he did, like I am still a human being? A breath escaped him. He had not realized he'd been holding it. He continued writing, the pencil gliding faster. I cleaned the flag because I could not leave it in the mud. I thought it deserved respect, but I did not expect them to understand. I did not expect them to see anything but the uniform I once wore. Instead, they saw me. His hand shook as he signed his name at the bottom of the entry. He closed the diary and let his head rest briefly in his palms. A quiet, moral awakening had begun, a crack forming in a wall that had been built in him since childhood. The next morning, something subtle shifted in the camp. When Johann walked to roll call, several prisoners glanced at him with a mixture of curiosity and something softer, respect, maybe, or relief that he had survived the encounter without punishment. Becker, the older veteran, patted him once on the shoulder as he passed. Fisher nodded, his eyes still red from the previous day's emotional collapse. Even those who had whispered fear or doubt now watched Johann with a new seriousness. Not admiration exactly, something deeper, a recognition that courage did not always look like men charging with rifles. Sometimes courage looked like a scrawny prisoner standing up straight with a flag in his hands. One of the younger POWs, Otto, approached him hesitantly during work detail. "What did he say to you?" Otto asked. "The captain." Johann hesitated, uncertain how to translate the weight of Miller's voice. He said, "That I returned their honor." Otto blinked, then his lips parted slowly. "He said that? To you?" Johann nodded. The news spread quietly, subtly, not through gossip, but through silence, through the way men watched Johann, the way they stepped aside to let him pass, the way their eyes lingered on the flagpole when they entered the yard. Something in them had shifted, and something in Johann had changed even more. Because now, when he looked at the Americans, the guards, the cooks, the officers, he no longer saw faceless enemies. He saw individuals. Men who worked, who sweated, who bled, who grieved. Men who saluted their flag each morning, not out of fear, but out of pride. He saw humanity where he had been taught to expect monsters. Over. The next week, the Americans offered no special treatment, no ceremony, no praise. But they treated Johann and all the prisoners with a steadiness that spoke louder. Fairness, order, decency. Corporal Dunn, during a tool distribution shift, handed Johann a hammer and said quietly, "Good job the other day." It was simple, almost gruff, but it landed with the weight of something rarer. Respect offered without condition. Private Hayes, who had barely spoken to prisoners before, nodded at Johann once while passing near the barracks. It was an awkward gesture, but honest. Sergeant Grayson said nothing at all. But he didn't need to. The slight softening around his eyes when he looked at Johann was enough. Even Captain Miller, who rarely lingered in the POW yard, paused once during inspections to look at Johann. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Steady, mutual, unspoken. Johann wasn't sure what the captain saw in him. But he knew what he saw in the captain. Leadership, grief, and a depth of character that pierced through every stereotype he had been raised with. Work details became less tense. Where before the prisoners worked mechanically, quietly, with the distance of men who expected cruelty at any moment, now they moved with an odd, unfamiliar ease. They still followed orders, still labored under the Texas heat, but their shoulders were less tight, their eyes wandered more. More than one POW dared small conversation with American guards. During a fence repair shift, Becker commented on the sturdiness of a post, and a Texan guard laughed. "We build 'em strong out here," the guard said, tapping the wood with a grin. For a moment, it didn't feel like prisoners and captors. It felt like workers on the same land. Even the Americans noticed the change. Some guards exchanged puzzled glances. Others simply accepted it as fact. The atmosphere was lighter. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't alliance. But it was the thin, fragile beginning of mutual respect. Johann's perception of America changed daily. Each morning he woke to the sound of the bugle and the sight of the flag rising above the yard. He found himself watching it longer than before, not with fear, nor with defiance, but with admiration and with confusion. He had spent his whole life hearing that America was decadent, weak, morally corrupt, but here he saw discipline, order, prosperity. He saw guards who enforced rules but never abused them. He saw cooks who fed prisoners with meals far better than German soldiers at the front received. He saw a country so wealthy that even its prisoners ate meat more regularly than civilians back home. Most of all, he saw a nation that fought like hell but refused to lose its humanity in the process. He felt a growing ache in his chest each time he reflected on it. Is this why they are winning the war? Because they do not become monsters, even when they have the power? Because they believe in something real, something stable? He didn't know the answers yet, but he felt them forming. The psychological impact of that day with the flag did not fade. For Johann, it was the moment he first felt the ground shift beneath him, the moment he realized he had been walking on a floor made of propaganda his whole life. For the German prisoners, it chipped away at years of conditioning. It made them question the certainty of their officers, the righteousness of their cause, and the stories they had swallowed without thought. For the American guards, it reaffirmed something many had begun to fear they were losing. Not strength, not dominance, but character. The ability to treat even the enemy with dignity, even in war, especially in war. And for Captain Miller, it was a reminder of who he was fighting for. Not a government, not a uniform, but a nation built on ideals that still lived, even in a dusty Texas camp. That night, as the flag rippled gently under the moonlight and the cicadas hummed in the dry grass, a strange harmony settled over Camp Hearn. Not peace, not yet, but understanding. A moral awakening had begun, quiet, steady, profound. And it started not with a speech, not with a battle, not with a treaty, but with a German boy lifting a fallen flag out of the mud. In the quiet after sunset, the American flag hung still above Camp Hearn, its edges glowing faintly in the last streaks of orange across the Texas sky. Johann often found himself staring at it now, not with fear, not with confusion, but with a strange tenderness that surprised him. He had begun to understand something the Americans themselves rarely put into words. The flag was not just a symbol of victory, it was a symbol of identity, of continuity, of a nation certain of who it was. And looking back from today, it is impossible not to feel the gulf between that America and the one we live in now. In 1944, America moved with the momentum of a country utterly sure of its purpose. There was division, of course, there always is, but beneath it ran a deep river of unity. The greatest generation believed in sacrifice, duty, service. Neighbors rationed sugar and rubber without complaint. Teenagers lied about their age to enlist. Factories ran day and night, filling the sky with the smoke of production, not decline. Jobs were plentiful. Civic pride was high. National morale was unshakable. In that era, America produced more than the Axis and the Allies combined, 1,000 aircraft in a single year, tens of thousands of tanks, ships, guns, trucks, uniforms, boots. Enough steel, food, and oil to feed entire continents. But it wasn't just the industrial might, it was the moral certainty. Americans believed, deeply, that they were fighting not only for survival, but for the idea that a free nation could remain humane, even while waging the most brutal war the world had ever known. In POW camps, that belief translated into action. They fed prisoners well. They treated them by the rules. They allowed libraries, gardens, orchestras. They prohibited abuse. They enforced the Geneva Convention with almost stubborn discipline. It wasn't softness, it was principle. A kind of moral clarity that made even Johann, raised on propaganda, stop and rethink everything he thought he knew about strength. It's impossible to tell Johann's story without hearing the echo of the present. Today, America is still powerful, but weary, still wealthy, but anxious, still free, but at odds with itself. The unity that once defined the war years feels distant. The confidence in American exceptionalism has eroded. The trust between neighbors is thinner. The belief that Americans share a common purpose feels more fragile. The factories that once roared like endless engines of democracy now stand silent in many towns, their windows broken, their jobs long gone overseas. The optimism that fueled the GI generation has given way to cynicism, doubt, and political battle lines that fracture families as deeply as nations. And yet, when we look back at the America Johann saw in 1944, it becomes clear that the country's greatest power wasn't the number of planes it built or the tanks it shipped to Europe. It was its character. The quiet dignity of guards who treated prisoners with fairness, the moral confidence of officers like Captain Miller, the steadfast belief that, even in war, a nation should not abandon its soul. And when we compare that to today, it's difficult not to ask, when did we begin to lose that spirit? When did we stop believing that kindness was a form of strength? When did we forget that dignity offered to others is a reflection of our own? Stories like Johann's remind us that America once possessed a moral gravity so powerful that even its enemies felt pulled toward it. A POW once wrote, "America fed us better than our own government ever did." Another wrote in his diary, "We arrived expecting cruelty. Instead, we found fairness. It changed us." And perhaps the most striking line found in a post-war memoir by a former German sergeant, "America defeated us not only with weapons, but with dignity. That was the victory we did not expect." These weren't sentimental reflections. They were honest testimonies from men who had been raised from childhood to despise the United States. When they left the camps, many carried home a seed of admiration so deep that thousands later emigrated to America, choosing to raise their children under the same flag they once fought against, because they saw something here, something big, something bright, something worth believing in. As Johann stood beneath the rising flag that morning, he wasn't thinking about politics or history or national identity. He was thinking about dignity, about respect, about what it meant for an enemy officer to look at him, a German prisoner, and speak of honor. But for us today, his moment becomes a mirror reflecting an America that fed prisoners during ration shortages, upheld laws even under extreme stress, treated enemies with humanity, held itself to a higher standard, chose dignity over cruelty, believed in something larger than victory. And when modern viewers look into that mirror, they can't help but feel two emotions at once. Pride, because this is where we come from. Sadness, because we feel how far we've drifted. Johann's story forces us to ask, what would it look like if we lived again with the confidence and compassion of the 1940s? What would this country feel like if we treated one another the way Captain Miller treated a German prisoner holding his flag? What would America become if we returned to the values that once made even our enemies respect us? Johann didn't know it then, but the moment he handed back that flag captured something rare. The essence of the greatest generation. the spirit of a nation united by principle. The quiet conviction that strength and kindness are not opposites. And decades later, when historians, descendants, and viewers revisit stories like his, they feel something stir deep inside, a longing for the America their grandparents spoke of. A country both powerful and merciful, a country both righteous and humble. A country that could raise a flag in the morning and raise its moral standards with it. That is the America Johann discovered in 1944, and that is the America many still hope to rediscover today. The truck bed rattled beneath Johann's boots as he climbed aboard, the wood warm beneath the rising June sun. Around him, German prisoners lifted their packs, exchanged farewells with guards they had once feared, and took their places for transport. The air smelled of dust, diesel, and something heavier, an ache of endings that settled quietly over the yard. Camp Hearn stretched before him one last time, the barracks lined in neat rows, the mess hall roof shimmering under the morning light, the fence that once felt like the edge of the world. But it was the flagpole that held Johann's gaze. There it stood, straight, unwavering, the American flag lifting and falling in the soft Texas wind. Just days earlier, he had touched that fabric with trembling hands. He had lifted it from the mud and handed it back to the very nation he'd been taught to hate. And that nation had answered with dignity rather than rage. As the truck engine coughed to life, Johann stepped to the corner of the wooden rail and held on. His eyes locked onto the flag as though memorizing every star, every stripe, every movement. A guard near the gate called out, "Clear the road." His voice was brisk but not harsh. It carried a note of respect that hadn't always been there. The truck lurched forward. Johann swallowed hard, something thick rising in his throat. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was something far more unsettling. Gratitude. He leaned forward slightly, compelled by a force he couldn't name, and whispered into the warm wind. "I came as a prisoner. A breath. I leave as a witness." Fisher, sitting beside him, turned his head. "A witness to what?" he asked softly. Johann didn't take his eyes off the flag. "A witness to American humanity." The words hung there, carried by dust and sunlight, drifting across a camp that had changed him more than he'd ever admit. As the truck rolled through the gates, Johann felt a strange tightening in his chest. He had arrived in this place terrified, hollow from hunger and propaganda, certain he would suffer until the war's end. But America had defied every expectation. The guards saluted the truck as it passed. Not showy, not ceremonial. Just a simple gesture of acknowledgement. A few nodded at the prisoners. One lifted his hand in a small wave. 2 months earlier, none of this would have made sense. Now it made all the difference. Johann took a slow breath, absorbing the scene. The sun brushing the tops of the barracks, the faint smell of breakfast drifting from the kitchen, the dust swirling in gentle spirals as if the earth itself were bidding farewell. "Remember this," he told himself. "Remember what dignity looks like. Remember what mercy feels like." Thousands of German POWs went home, some to ruins, some to hunger, some to uncertainty. Their country lay in rubble. Their cities had been reduced to ash. Their government, once so confident, so loud, had dissolved into shame. But something unexpected happened. Many of them could not forget the America they had seen behind the wire. Some wrote letters to their former guards, thanking them for their humanity. Others sent photographs, drawings, small tokens fashioned in the camps. A few saved the camp-issued booklets about American laws and customs, rereading them as if studying a new philosophy. And some, more than people realize, came back. not as prisoners but as immigrants. They returned because America had shown them a version of life that felt honest, dignified, humane, a place where even enemies were fed well, treated fairly, and looked in the eye instead of down upon. Records show that by the 1950s, thousands of former German POWs applied for visas to the United States. Many succeeded. They married, worked, raised families, and built quiet lives in the very nation they once fought against. One former POW would later tell an interviewer, "We arrived as captives. We left as admirers." Their children and their grandchildren grew up hearing stories of the camps that sounded impossible compared to the Europe of wartime suffering. A granddaughter from Hamburg once wrote to an American archive, "My grandfather always cried when he smelled bacon. He said the Americans fed him kindness along with food." Another family in Munich kept a small American flag framed in their living room, the one their father had carried home from a Texas ranch where he had worked during captivity. He said the Americans treated the flag with devotion, the daughter wrote. He wanted us to understand what that meant. A man in Bremen wrote in a letter, "My father told us he learned the meaning of the word freedom from Americans who guarded him." In 1987, a group of former POWs traveled back to the United States to visit the sites of the camps where they had been held. Many were old men by then, walking slowly with canes, leaning on their grandchildren. But when they reached Camp Hearn's memorial marker, several simply stood in silence, staring at the empty field where the barracks once stood. One laid a small American flag at the base of the marker, another touched the stone and whispered, "Danke." They didn't come out of nostalgia for captivity. They came out of gratitude for mercy. And in the decades since the war, American readers, historians, and ordinary families who discover these stories find themselves experiencing something deeper than historical curiosity. They feel pride in the nation their fathers and grandfathers built, a nation that fought fiercely without surrendering its soul, a nation that held to its values when the world was tearing itself apart. They feel longing for the unity and decency of that time, a longing for the America that believed compassion was a form of strength. They feel gratitude, because stories like Johann's remind them that moral courage matters, that kindness leaves a legacy beyond generations. And many feel a quiet sorrow, because something in these stories forces a painful comparison to today. The America of the 1940s was not perfect, but it was principled. It was generous. It was united in purpose. It knew what it stood for. Today, as the country faces division, cynicism, and noise, stories like Johann's rise like a lighthouse cutting through fog. They remind us that America was once a place where even prisoners were treated with dignity, where guards raised their hands not to strike, but to salute, where a fallen flag could become a moment of reconciliation instead of rage. They remind us that the true power of the United States has never been found solely in its armies or its factories, but in its character. And so, as the truck carrying Johann Keller disappeared down the dusty Texas road, leaving Camp Hearn behind, he took more than memories with him. He carried a lesson, a conviction, a seed of admiration that would shape the rest of his life. The America he saw was not just strong, it was good, and as he whispered his final words toward the flag rising behind him, "I came as a prisoner, I leave as a witness." He spoke a truth that would echo across oceans and generations. A truth still worth remembering today. America's greatest victories were not won by might alone, but by mercy. Not by the power of its weapons, but by the generosity of its spirit. And stories like these remind us, we once were the light of the world. May we choose to be that light again.